A group of thieves breaks into a forgotten mansion, unaware of the deadly secrets hidden inside. But when their escape is blocked by vicious dogs and an ancient curse, they realize the mansion isn't just haunted, it's hunting them. What is the true price of the treasure they've awakened, and will anyone survive to stop it? The forest road stretched endlessly, shrouded in fog that seemed to cling to the tires of the battered pickup truck. Raoul sat behind the wheel, his sharp gaze fixed ahead, while Hector idly flipped a switchblade in the passenger seat. Luz, squeezed into the back with their gear, kept her eyes on the dense trees, her fingers gripping her pendant tightly. "This place gives me the creeps," Luz murmured, breaking the silence. Raoul glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "It's just a house, Luz. Don't let the stories mess with your head." "You mean the stories about people going in and never coming out?" she shot back, her tone laced with sarcasm. Hector chuckled, though it sounded forced. "That's just to scare kids. We'll be in and out before anyone knows we were there." The truck came to a halt at the end of a gravel path. Before them loomed the mansion, an old, decrepit structure swallowed by creeping ivy and shadows. The air was unnervingly still, as though the world itself held its breath. Raoul was the first to step out, slinging a crowbar over his shoulder. "We're here for the valuables, don't get distracted," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The trio approached the house cautiously. Luz hesitated at the gate, her unease palpable. "This place, it feels wrong," she said. "Enough," Raoul snapped. "We've come too far to back out now." Inside, the mansion was a relic of another era, with ornate furniture draped in cobwebs and a thick layer of dust blanketing every surface. The air carried a faint metallic scent, and the floorboards groaned under their weight as they spread out to search. "This doesn't look abandoned," Luz said softly, her eyes scanning the polished brass fixtures and a cracked chandelier that still glittered faintly. Raoul ignored her, opening drawers and cabinets methodically. Hector moved upstairs, his footsteps echoing faintly. Luz lingered near the doorway, her discomfort growing with every passing moment. Suddenly, a faint rustling noise broke the silence. Luz froze, her heart pounding as her eyes darted to the source, a darkened corner of the room. She strained her ears, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it began. "I told you, this place isn't right," she hissed, stepping closer to Raoul. He waved her off, brushing past her toward a large cabinet. "You're hearing things. Focus on finding something worthwhile." Unbeknownst to them, a pair of golden eyes glinted briefly outside the cracked window. A low growl rumbled in the distance, carried by the night air. As the group continued their search, a sense of unease began to settle over them. The house felt alive, each creak and groan of the structure echoing like a warning. "Guys," Hector called from the staircase, his voice tight. "I think we're being watched." Raoul shot him an incredulous look. "By who? The ghost Luz keeps talking about?" "No," Hector said, glancing nervously out a second-floor window. "By them." Luz and Raoul followed his gaze to see shadows moving just beyond the tree line. The unmistakable shapes of large dogs prowled the perimeter, their movements synchronized and predatory. "Let's finish this and leave," Luz said, her voice trembling. But as the first faint howl pierced the air, even Raoul couldn't shake the feeling that they had just crossed an invisible boundary, one that would be impossible to retreat from. The mansion's oppressive silence shattered with a deafening clamor. A shrill metallic whine echoed through the halls, making Luz and Raoul wince as Hector cursed from the second floor. "What the hell was that?" Raoul barked, gripping his crowbar. I don't know. I leaned on something and it just went off," Hector stammered, his face pale as he descended the staircase 2 steps at a time. Luz clutched her pendant, her voice rising in panic. "That was an alarm. You triggered something." The sound reverberated through the mansion, rising and falling like a macabre symphony. Outside, the low growls intensified, blending into the noise. Then, as though answering an unspoken command, the growls turned to furious barking. Raoul moved to the window, peering through a crack in the heavy drapes. What he saw made him curse under his breath. "They're coming." The dogs had emerged fully from the shadows, a pack of sleek, muscled beasts, with eyes that gleamed unnaturally in the moonlight. They moved with purpose, circling the house like wolves around wounded prey. "They're just dogs," Raoul muttered, though his grip on the crowbar tightened. "They don't look normal," Luz whispered, inching away from the door. The first impact came like a thunderclap. One of the dogs launched itself against the front door, the wood shuddering under the force. Others followed, snarling and clawing at the windows, their teeth bared in feral hunger. "Barricade the doors," Raoul ordered, snapping the group out of their frozen state. They scrambled to drag furniture toward the entrances, cabinets, chairs, and even an old dresser shoved haphazardly into place. The banging and growling continued, relentless and growing more frenzied by the second. "This isn't gonna hold," Hector said, his voice quivering. "It has to," Raoul shot back. A sudden crash from the kitchen made Luz scream. They turned in unison to see a shattered window, jagged shards of glass glinting on the tiled floor. One of the dogs had forced its way in, its massive body bristling with muscle and fury. Raoul didn't hesitate. He swung the crowbar with all his strength, the metal connecting with a sickening thud. The dog yelped and staggered, retreating momentarily before lunging again. Hector grabbed a chair, swinging it wildly until the creature finally retreated through the broken window, snarling as it vanished into the night. Panting, Raoul slammed the kitchen door shut and jammed a heavy table against it. "They're testing us. They'll find another way in if we're not careful." "They're not just testing us. They're hunting us," Luz said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a brief moment, the house fell silent except for the frantic breathing of the trio. Then, a chorus of howls erupted outside, long and bone-chilling. "They're not giving up," Hector said, slumping against the wall, his hands trembling. "We need a plan," Raoul said, pacing. "We can't stay here forever." Luz stared at the door, her mind racing. "We need to find something they're afraid of, or a way out." "Way out," Hector scoffed. "In case you forgot, they're everywhere." Raoul raised a hand to silence them, his jaw clenched. "Enough. We'll figure it out, but we can't panic." The growls resumed, closer this time, as though the dogs were right outside the barricades. The oppressive weight of their predicament settled over them like a suffocating shroud. "They're not just dogs," Luz muttered, her eyes distant. "There's something wrong about them, something unnatural." Raoul ignored her, but Hector's gaze lingered, fear flickering in his eyes. Outside, the dogs continued their siege, their relentless assault on the mansion like a dark omen of what was to come. The night stretched on, thick and suffocating, as the mansion seemed to close in around them. The house's groaning walls were now joined by the relentless barking and scratching from outside, a constant reminder of the pack that surrounded them. The barricades, hastily thrown together, seemed to be more of a temporary fix than a real solution. Raoul paced the dimly lit hallway, his face drawn with frustration. "We can't just sit here. We need to move." "We'll get ourselves killed if we try to escape through that mess of dogs," Luz countered, standing by the window, her eyes scanning the perimeter. Hector, who had been quieter than usual, was now hunched in a corner, his hands twitching as if he could still feel the bite of the dog's claws. "Maybe we should just wait until daylight. These damn things can't keep this up forever, right?" Raoul shook his head, his frustration bubbling over. "We can't afford to wait. We need to find a way out of here now, before they get smarter." Luz's gaze flickered to him, an edge of skepticism in her eyes. "You've been saying that for hours. Maybe it's time we rethink things." Raoul snapped, his voice sharp. "I said no more talking. We move or we die in here. Make your choice." The tension in the room was thick, but before any of them could respond, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. All three of them jumped, their hearts racing. "What was that?" Luz asked, voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Raoul said through gritted teeth, "but we need to check it out." Reluctantly, they moved toward the stairs, the floorboards creaking under their weight. As they ascended, the sounds grew louder, scraping, shuffling, as if something was dragging itself across the floor. The top of the stairs revealed a hallway shrouded in darkness, the once grand paintings on the walls now streaked with dust and age. Hector motioned to a door at the end of the hall. "That room was locked earlier. Maybe there's something inside." Luz nodded, her unease growing with every step. "Let's just be careful." Raoul moved toward the door first, his crowbar raised. With a swift motion, he wrenched it open, revealing a small, musty room. At first, it seemed ordinary enough, an old desk, a cracked mirror. But then something caught Luz's eye. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden behind a heavy curtain, was a trapdoor. It wasn't large, but the faint scent of damp earth drifted from beneath it. This could be something," Luz murmured, her fingers tracing the outline of the trapdoor. Raoul stepped forward, his earlier resolve returning. "This is it. This could be our way out." But just as he was about to open it, the unmistakable sound of nails scraping against wood echoed from behind them. The dogs had found another way in. "They're inside," Hector shouted, panic seeping into his voice. Without thinking, Raúl rushed to the trapdoor, pulling it open with all his strength. The narrow staircase leading down was barely visible in the dim light, but it seemed like their only hope. "Go!" Raúl barked, shoving Luz and Hector ahead of him. "Get down there. I'll hold them off." "No," Luz protested, her face contorted with fear. "Raúl, we need to stick together." But he ignored her, pushing her toward the stairs. "Now, Luz." Reluctantly, she descended first, her feet scrambling to find purchase on the slick steps. Hector followed closely behind her, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. As Raúl took one last glance at the hallway, a shadow darted from the corner of his vision. A dog, a massive black creature, lunged toward him. Raúl swung his crowbar with all his might, striking the beast in the head. The dog yelped, staggering back, but it was only momentary. More were coming. He had no time to hesitate. He slammed the trapdoor shut and followed the others down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The subterranean air was cold and musty, the walls damp and lined with ancient stone. They stumbled through the dark, their breath ragged in the silence. But despite the darkness, Luz couldn't shake the feeling that something else was down here. "Raúl, what if there's another way out?" Luz asked, her voice trembling. Raúl paused, his gaze flicking to the dimly lit tunnel ahead. "We'll find it. We have to." But even as he said the words, the sound of claws scraping on stone echoed from the darkness. The dogs were getting closer, and they were not alone down there. The narrow passage seemed endless, the air growing heavier with every step they took. Raúl led the way, his senses on high alert, while Luz and Hector followed closely behind, their footsteps muted in the damp silence. The flickering light from Raúl's flashlight barely cut through the oppressive darkness, casting long, distorted shadows on the stone walls. "What is this place?" Luz whispered, her voice barely audible as they navigated the winding corridor. Raúl didn't answer immediately, his attention fixed on the tunnel ahead. The stone beneath their feet felt uneven, as if the floor had been worn down by years of neglect. Every so often, the faint sound of something scraping along the walls reached their ears, but it was impossible to tell if it was the wind, an animal, or something far worse. The further they descended, the colder it became. The air carried a musty, earthy smell, like the dampness of a forgotten crypt. It was clear that this was no ordinary basement. This was a place designed to be hidden, a secret kept buried deep beneath the mansion. At the end of the tunnel, they reached a heavy wooden door, its surface worn and scarred by time. There was no handle, just a faint, rusted keyhole. Luz stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. "This is it," she said quietly. "I think we're supposed to go through here." Raúl gave her a sharp look. "There's no time for guessing. Let's just get it open." He tried the door with force, but it didn't budge. For a moment, there was silence. Then the faint sound of metal scraping against stone echoed through the tunnel. Luz held her breath as Raúl knelt down, inspecting the lock. "It's old, but I can break it," he muttered, his fingers working deftly at the lock. With a final click, the door swung open, revealing a dimly lit room that sent a chill racing down Luz's spine. The walls were lined with dusty wooden crates, some stacked high, others broken open, their contents spilling out onto the cold floor. Raúl's flashlight swept across the room, illuminating old furniture, forgotten antiques, and piles of long-forgotten papers. But it was what lay in the center of the room that caught Luz's eye. A large iron cage stood in the middle, its door ajar. Inside, something glinted faintly in the darkness, something small, delicate, and oddly out of place. "What is that?" Hector asked, stepping forward. Raúl raised a hand to stop him. "Don't move any closer," he warned. "We don't know what's inside." But it was too late. Hector was already at the cage, his hand reaching for the object. "Wait!" Luz cried out. As Hector touched the object, the room seemed to shift. A soft, almost inaudible growl rumbled from the shadows, sending a wave of unease through the group. Raúl's heart raced as his flashlight flickered in his hand. "Get back!" Raúl shouted, pulling Hector away from the cage just as something moved in the dark corner. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall, cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing faintly as they locked onto the group. It was not human. The creature stood motionless, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness surrounding it. Luz stepped back, her pulse quickening as the figure remained still. It made no move toward them, but the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, as though something ancient had just awoken. "What the hell is that?" Luz whispered, her voice trembling. Raoul didn't answer. His mind raced as he scanned the room for an escape route. But then, his eyes fell on the old crates. Among them was a stack of weathered journals, their spines cracked and frayed with age. One of them had fallen open, its pages yellowed and brittle. He reached for it, the pages fluttering as he turned them. The words were faded, but enough was legible to send a shiver down his spine. "Listen to this," Raoul murmured. The dogs were bred for protection. They were trained to guard what was hidden in the mansion's depths, the treasure, the secret. He paused, the significance of the words sinking in. "Treasure," Hector repeated, disbelief creeping into his voice. Raoul nodded slowly, his thoughts racing. This mansion was more than just a hiding place. It was a vault, a prison for something valuable. And these dogs... He gestured to the darkness beyond the cage. They weren't just guard dogs, they were protectors of something far more dangerous. Luz's eyes flickered to the creature in the shadows. "And that thing?" Raoul swallowed hard. "I don't know, but it's clear now. This place isn't just a mansion. It's a tomb, a place where things were hidden away. And we're not the only ones who want to get out." As the creature's glowing eyes fixed on them, a bone-chilling growl escaped its throat. Luz's hand instinctively went to the knife at her waist. "Run," Raoul ordered, his voice low but urgent. Before any of them could react, the creature moved, its form a blur of motion, and the hunt began once again. The creature's growl echoed in the confined space, its eyes gleaming in the dim light as it advanced with terrifying speed. Raoul's breath caught in his throat. There was no question now. It wasn't just a guardian of the mansion, it was a predator. Just like the dogs outside, but far more dangerous. "Move!" Raoul shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. Luz, Hector, and Raoul dashed for the door. But as Raoul reached for the handle, a low growl made him freeze. The creature had moved faster than he could track, blocking their path with a twisted, predatory grace. "Damn it!" Raoul cursed, his mind racing. There was nowhere to go. The creature was between them and the exit. Behind them, the soft rustling of movement grew louder. The sound of claws skittering against stone. The dogs were closing in on them too. "We're trapped!" Luz gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hand tightened around her knife, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. "Raoul, we need to think of something now!" Raoul's eyes darted around the room. The creature wasn't charging yet. It was watching them, studying them as if toying with them. His instincts screamed at him to act fast, but the growing sense of dread made his limbs feel heavier. Suddenly, Hector made a move that shocked them all. With a panicked cry, he lunged forward, not at the creature, but at the door behind it. He attempted to shove the door open with all his strength, the door frame creaking under the pressure. "Hector, no!" Luz cried, but it was too late. The creature lunged at Hector, faster than anyone could react. A bone-chilling howl rang out as its jaws sank deep into Hector's arm, dragging him to the ground with an audible crunch. "Hector!" Luz screamed, rushing toward him. But Raoul caught her arm, pulling her back. "We can't help him!" he hissed. "We have to go! Now!" Luz fought against his grip, tears streaming down her face. "We can't leave him! Hector's gone, Luz!" Raoul shouted, his voice full of urgency. "We don't make it out if we stay here!" For a moment, it was as if time had stopped. Luz's eyes locked on Hector, who was desperately trying to free himself from the creature's clutches. His face twisted in agony, his body already pale from the loss of blood. But then, with a final, desperate effort, Hector jerked his arm free, shoving the creature away with whatever strength he had left. The creature hissed, a horrible screech that made Luz's blood run cold. But it didn't follow them. Instead, it turned its attention to the hole Hector had created in the door and slithered into the darkness beyond. Raoul didn't wait for any more hesitation. He shoved Luz toward the trapdoor. "Go, now!" She stumbled toward the stairs, but before she could move down, a loud howl echoed through the tunnel. The dogs were close, far too close. The sound sent a wave of terror through her, making her legs feel like jelly. Raoul followed her, his crowbar raised. "You have to go," Raoul said, voice steady but strained. "I'll hold them off." Luz shook her head. "No, we're not leaving you behind." Raoul grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip firm. You don't have a choice. Get to the tunnel and don't look back. Do you hear me? Tears stung Luz's eyes, but she nodded, unable to find the words to protest. She turned and bolted down the narrow stairs, her heart heavy with guilt and fear. Hector's anguished screams echoed in her mind, and the sound of the dog's growls filled the air, getting closer. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, a loud crash came from above. Raul had made his stand. Luz fought the urge to turn back, to run back up and try to help, but she knew that wasn't possible. Suddenly, there was a flicker of light. The tunnel ahead was dim, but enough for her to see the faint outline of another door. It was old, worn with age, but still intact. It could be their way out. She turned to Hector, who was close behind her, his face pale and drawn, the wound from the dog's assault still bleeding. His hand trembled as he gripped the wall for support. "I don't think we're getting out of here," Hector whispered hoarsely, looking back up the tunnel as if waiting for the inevitable. Luz's heart tightened. She couldn't even bring herself to respond. She pushed open the door with shaking hands, praying it would lead them to safety. The air outside was thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. It felt like they were in some forgotten part of the world, a place where time had stopped. The silence of the forest was deafening after the chaos of the mansion. But Luz knew, deep down, that even though they had escaped the mansion, they hadn't truly escaped the nightmare. The dogs were still out there, hunting them. And as she glanced at the bloodied wound on Hector's side, she wondered if this brief respite would be their last. The night air outside was cold, the dampness clinging to their skin as Luz and Hector stumbled through the forest, the weight of their exhaustion pressing heavily on them. They had escaped the mansion, barely, but their survival felt hollow. Their minds were clouded with the image of Raul, sacrificing himself to keep the creatures at bay. The thought of leaving him behind still gnawed at Luz, but there was no turning back now. Hector, his face pale and covered in sweat, winced as he adjusted his grip on his side, the wound from the dog's bite throbbing painfully. He staggered a few steps, then leaned against a nearby tree for support. "We need to keep moving," Luz said, her voice tight with urgency. She couldn't afford to stop, not when they were so close to safety, whatever that meant now. Hector didn't respond immediately. His eyes were distant, staring into the dark forest as if hoping it might offer him an answer. But his mind was far from the woods. His thoughts kept returning to the bloodied scene they had left behind. The screams, the chaos, the certainty that they had lost more than just their way out. "I can't keep going," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Luz's heart twisted at his words. She wanted to argue, to tell him they had no choice but to keep moving, but she knew he was right. They were both broken, physically, emotionally. The mansion's horrors were not so easily shaken off. "We'll rest for a moment," she said softly, though the decision pained her. "We can't push too hard. We need a plan." But Hector's eyes met hers with a cold, defeated look that made her stomach twist. "A plan?" he asked bitterly. "What for? There's nothing left. We've lost everything." His words hung in the air, like a heavy fog that clouded their chances of survival. He was right, in a way. Their group had fractured beyond repair. Raul's sacrifice had been the final blow to their unity, and now they were two strangers running from the same nightmare. Luz didn't know how to respond. She wanted to tell him they still had a chance, that they could make it out of this alive if they kept moving, kept fighting. But the truth was, she wasn't sure anymore. The mansion's dark secrets, the dogs, the creature, they had all changed them, and there was no telling what awaited them outside those woods. "I'm not going back," Luz said quietly, though the words felt heavy in her mouth. Hector didn't look at her, instead staring blankly into the forest. "And I'm not going forward," he replied. "Not like this. I can't keep running." Luz's chest tightened as she realized what he was saying. The weight of his words sank in, a painful truth she hadn't wanted to face. Hector was done. He wasn't just physically drained, he had mentally given up. And she couldn't make him keep going if he wasn't willing to try. For a long moment, they both stood in the darkness, the cold air pressing in around them. The sound of the forest seemed distant, the normal rhythms of nature replaced by an unsettling silence. Luz had never felt so alone. "I can't do this alone, Hector," she whispered, her voice breaking. His gaze finally met hers, hollow and lost. "Maybe it's better if you do. Maybe you'll have a better chance. Luz felt a sharp pang of guilt. You're not serious. I am, Hector said, his voice flat. You know what's out there. And you're right. We can't keep running forever. I'm slowing you down. Luz shook her head, a mix of frustration and pain swirling inside her. No, you're not. You're not slowing me down. Hector's lips twisted into a grim smile. You know I'm right. I'm not the same as I was when we started this. I don't have the strength to keep going. You've seen what's waiting for us if we stay. She wanted to argue, to tell him that they were a team, that they couldn't just give up, but the words stuck in her throat. Hector wasn't just giving up on their mission, he was giving up on himself, and Luz couldn't force him to keep going if he didn't have the will to fight. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Luz stood in the dark, torn between her desire to keep going and the bitter reality that she couldn't drag him with her anymore. I'll keep going, she said, finally breaking the silence. But I won't leave you here alone. I'll stay with you until you're ready to move. But if we're going to make it, we have to be honest with each other. No more lies. Hector nodded slowly, his gaze distant. I can't promise I'll be ready, but maybe I'll try. For you. Luz exhaled, feeling a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was something, and it was all she could ask for. They didn't speak again as they settled down by the base of the tree, the weight of their unspoken thoughts hanging heavily between them. But for the first time since they had entered the mansion, Luz allowed herself to close her eyes and rest. Tomorrow would come, and they would face whatever it brought together, or at least they would try. The morning light filtered weakly through the trees, casting long shadows over the ground as Luz and Hector continued their slow journey through the dense forest. Despite the exhaustion that weighed heavily on them, there was a quiet resolve in their steps. The events of the night before had torn them apart, but now, with the faintest sliver of daylight ahead, they were forced to face what they had left behind and what they might still uncover. Luz glanced at Hector, whose pace had slowed even more since the previous night. His wound, though not life-threatening, was clearly affecting him, the pain reflected in the way he winced with every movement. She kept a close eye on him, knowing that she couldn't afford to lose him completely, not now. Yet in the back of her mind, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something bigger was still lurking just beyond their reach. The mansion, the creatures, the strange object in the cage, it all pointed to a truth neither of them had fully grasped. Do you think Raoul knew? Luz asked, her voice low but filled with the weight of her question. Hector's brow furrowed. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the uneven ground beneath his feet. The question wasn't one he wanted to face, but Luz wasn't letting it go. The mystery was too deep, the answers too elusive for them to simply walk away. Raoul was always obsessed with finding the treasure, Hector muttered finally, his voice thick with the memories of their friend's reckless ambition. He believed it was real. He believed it was worth everything, even his life. Luz nodded slowly, her eyes clouded with sadness. She hadn't known Raoul as well as Hector had, but she had seen his obsession consume him. They had all been drawn to the mansion for different reasons, but in the end, Raoul's obsession had been the one thing that had pushed them to their breaking point. But there was more to that place, wasn't there? The dogs, the creature. The treasure wasn't just gold, was it? Hector didn't reply, but the haunted look in his eyes told her all she needed to know. He hadn't forgotten the look on Raoul's face when he had finally understood what the mansion had been hiding, what it had been guarding. The truth had been more horrifying than any of them had anticipated. As they trudged deeper into the forest, a faint memory stirred in Luz's mind. The journal she had found in the mansion's basement, the one with the faded writing about the dogs, the treasure, and the mansion's dark secrets. Her hand instinctively went to the backpack she still carried, pulling it open and rifling through the remaining pages. Wait, Luz said, pulling out the journal with urgency. I think I missed something. She quickly scanned the page in front of her, her finger tracing the faded ink as the words slowly began to come together in her mind. The creatures were born of the mansion's curse, trained to guard the secret at all costs. They will not stop until it is returned to its rightful place. Luz stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The secret. The creatures. Raoul was right. Hector looked over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he read the words aloud. What was hidden beneath the mansion was not just a treasure of riches, but a power that must never be released. Those who seek it must face the wrath of the guardians. The meaning of the words sank in like a stone. It wasn't just gold they had been searching for, it was something far more dangerous. The mansion, with its twisted creatures and hidden chambers, had been built to protect something ancient and powerful, something that the dogs and the creatures weren't just guarding, they were ensuring its containment. The dogs. The creature. Luz muttered, feeling a chill run down her spine. They weren't just there to scare us. They were there to stop us from releasing something that shouldn't be touched. Hector shook his head, the realization settling over him like a heavy fog. We unleashed it. When we went into the basement, when we found the object Raoul was obsessed with, that's when it all began. The creatures, the curse, everything. Luz's hands trembled as she gripped the journal. So it's not over, the danger's still out there. No, Hector replied quietly, his voice grim. It's never over. Not until the curse is lifted. And there's only one way that can happen. Luz felt a sudden, desperate sense of urgency fill her chest. What way? Hector met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something dark and unsettling in his expression. We have to return it, he said softly. We have to return whatever it is we took, or it will never stop hunting us. Luz felt a cold, sickening realization hit her. The dogs, the creature, the mansion itself had been designed to prevent this, to keep whatever they had unwittingly disturbed from being unleashed. We need to go back, Luz whispered, barely believing the words herself. We need to stop it. But Hector's face tightened with fear, his voice barely a whisper. And if it's too late? The silence between them stretched long, the weight of their dilemma pressing heavily on both of them. The forest felt quieter now, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for the decision they would make. The air was thick with the scent of decay as Luz and Hector returned to the mansion. Every step felt like a betrayal, yet there was no turning back now. The creatures, the guardians, were still out there watching, waiting. We need to move quickly, Luz said, her voice tight with determination. She wasn't sure if she was convincing herself or Hector. The mansion stood before them, its dark windows like hollow eyes, staring down at their return. Hector gripped his side, his face pale, but he nodded. We don't have a choice. The doors, once barricaded, creaked open with a violent gust of wind. Inside, the mansion felt colder, the silence more oppressive than ever. Shadows danced in every corner. The growls came first, distant, but unmistakable. The dogs had found them. Luz's heart raced as they ventured deeper into the mansion. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards sent chills down her spine. Suddenly, the creatures appeared from the shadows, their glowing eyes locked on the intruders. There was no running now. We fight or we die, Luz muttered, her knife clenched tightly in her hand. Hector stood by her side, breath shaky, but his resolve had returned. Together, they would face the beasts and the curse that bound them. The tunnel stretched endlessly before them, the walls closing in as the growls of the beasts grew louder, closer. Luz and Hector's breaths were ragged, their bodies exhausted from the relentless pursuit of the creatures that had been hunting them for so long. We can't keep running like this, Hector gasped, stumbling slightly as he clutched his side. Blood still seeped from his wound, but there was no time to stop. The dogs were relentless. Luz looked ahead, her mind working in overdrive. The tunnel was their only chance, but it led deeper into the mansion's bowels, into the heart of the secret they had uncovered. There was no going back now. Suddenly, a faint glimmer caught her eye, a narrow opening in the stone. Her heart skipped. There, she whispered, pulling Hector toward it. That's the way out. But as they neared, the unmistakable sound of paws scraping against stone echoed behind them. They had no time at all. Hector, we have to move faster, Luz urged, her voice trembling. He nodded, pushing himself forward despite the pain. The opening was close now, their escape within reach. But the dogs weren't far behind, and the clock was ticking. Luz and Hector emerged from the tunnel, collapsing onto the forest floor, their bodies bruised and battered from the flight. The night air felt almost suffocating, cold and sharp against their skin, but it was a welcome change from the mansion's suffocating darkness. Hector gasped for air, his wounds still bleeding, his body trembling with exhaustion. He looked over at Luz, her face streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes still held a spark of determination. "We made it," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. But as they lay there, catching their breath, the distant howls of the dogs echoed through the trees, their voices twisted and haunting. The chase wasn't over. They hadn't escaped. The creatures, the curse, they were still out there waiting. Hector reached into his backpack, his hand trembling, and pulled out the strange object they had taken from the mansion. It glinted faintly in the moonlight, its true purpose still unknown, but its presence was enough to make them both shudder. "Raul didn't get to see this," Luz muttered, her voice breaking. "He didn't survive to see what we unleashed." With heavy hearts, they realized the cost of their survival. The bitter truth was clear. They had escaped the mansion, but the nightmare was far from over. In the end, the mansion's curse reveals a harsh truth. Some treasures are better left buried, and not every mystery should be uncovered. Raul, Luz, and Hector were driven by greed and curiosity, but it was their choices, unaware of the consequences, that led to their downfall. The real question is, how far would you go in the pursuit of something you don't fully understand? Would you risk everything, even your life, to uncover the truth? Click the video on the screen to continue this journey of self-discovery. What would you do in their shoes? Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more thrilling stories and lessons from the unknown. The journey isn't over. Join us and be part of the adventure. Thank you for watching.